Lucrezia Gigante, and which is currently a PhD candidate in the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester in UK. For this doctoral research, she was awarded a scholarship from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. She holds a master's degree in classics from the Università Cattolica of Milan and a Master of Arts in Art Museum and Gallery Studies from the University of Leicester. As a researcher and museum professional, her general interests lie within the social impact of the arts. Her focus is on participatory practices and engagement strategies in art museums and galleries as ways to activate culture through sociability in terms of cultural citizenship. She has worked as communication and engagement consultant for various organizations, including the archaeological part of Pompeii and the global network of water museums. Today, Lucrezia Gigante Interventions is entitled Participatory Practices, from Engagement to Co-Curation. So Lucrezia, I'm very pleased to give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the introduction. I'll share the screen. Let me know if everything is working properly. Should be, hopefully.
Perfect.
Can you see?
Yes.
Presentation? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much. I guess I'll start by introducing myself a bit and my research interest. But what I would like you to do as well is maybe to put in the chat your name, your affiliation, whether it's a university or an organization. So we all know a little bit about each other. I guess it's a good way of doing a bit of networking and also for me to get a sense of who's in the room. So as already Sarah said, I'm a PhD researcher based at the School of Museum Studies in Leicester in the UK. My background is in classics and museum studies, and my doctoral project investigates the idea of cultural citizenship and look at strategies of engagement as pathways to wider cultural participation across the urban space. In particular, I focus on participatory practices within public programs in art museums and galleries. And from a methodological point of view, I conduct my research through semi-structured interviews with museum professionals and participatory mapping with members of the public. So it's not only a research project on participation, but one where participation is embedded in its very design. And we'll come back shortly to how participatory practices can be employed by museums to engage their audiences, but also by researchers to conduct research on and with museums. The idea at the core of participatory practices is that meaning is co-created and co-constructed, and participants are equally involved in this process. So for me, what really draws me professionally and personally to participatory practices is their relational dimension, this idea that the interactions between these different communities of people, so museum staff on one side and the public members on the other, produce the social space of the museum. How people come together to create meaning based on shared experiences. To me, if museums are able to interact with their publics and dialogue with them in meaningful, mutual, trustworthy ways, then they really have a chance to make a difference and be agents of social change. So nice to meet you all. And I hope this presentation also gives you a different take on participatory practices. I will be talking a little bit about methods, possibly covering something that Giulio hasn't covered in his presentation. We'll have a few more chances to interact. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll have some time at the end for questions again. So in today's presentation, I would like to start from, I'm just trying to get my slides. Yes. I would like to start from reflecting very briefly on the potential participatory practices for museums themselves, but also for research on museums. In other words, on participatory research methods within humanities and social sciences. We will then focus more closely on museum practices, exploring first of all the language around this kind of work and the implications involved. We will then ground participatory practice through museum studies theory, strategic documents from the cultural and museum sector, and practice-based research. In the final part of the talk, we will look at a series of case studies varying from engagement to co-curation, as said in the title. These examples are taken from art museums and heritage sites through a mixture of approaches. Of course, the implications of COVID and the repercussions of COVID-19 on museum participation have been tangible, and there will be a chance to reflect on this as well as we go through the case studies. If you have any interesting examples of participatory practices as well, I'd be very happy to hear about them, maybe at the end of the presentation. So if there are any questions at this point, I'll begin by talking about the participatory research methods in social sciences and humanities, and how this can be applied in a way to museum practices. I guess I'm thinking in terms of evaluation strategies and evaluation of programs, for example. So participatory methods are used in qualitative research in social sciences and humanities as an alternative to more traditional top-down approaches to knowledge production. They include different creative forms of communication like participatory mapping, drama and performances, participatory photography or video production, drawing, and creative writing. Using collaborative processes, participants and facilitators work together to produce new knowledge. So from an epistemological point of view, participatory methods challenge the ways of positivist knowledge production by valuing the contribution of multiple actors engaged as experts on their own subjective experience of the world. In other words, researchers and participants are equally contributing their knowledge and expertise to the open-ended process of inquiry. They are effectively co-researchers by all means. And this means that participatory methods are inherently pluralistic and based on mutuality and exchange. They value the local knowledge of participants as their underpinning ontology is the assumption that humans are dynamic agents capable of reflexivity and self-change, carriers of their own subjective worldviews, all considered equally valid and contributing to a socially constructed sense of reality. In other words, participants are considered experts in their own rights. As a result, the assumptions that the researchers bring into the room are often challenged, and facilitators should be prepared to unlearn what's already been learned. Through intersections with feminist theory, the objectivity of the isolated academic researcher is critically questioned and replaced with a collective way of knowing through oral and visual expressions. Taking part in participatory research can be a transformative experience for everyone, both the researcher and the co-researchers, or all co-researchers, as there is a high degree of reflexivity involved. Another feature of participatory methods is their potential to maximize participation. So, for example, the use of visual aids can be really helpful and also function as a catalyst for discussion. By reducing the barriers of cultural differences, lack of confidence, or eloquence through the visual. In this sense, participatory creative methods can also be very inclusive because being creative and playful can encourage participants to explore new ways of thinking and acting. Obviously, there are some ethical considerations to be taken carefully into account. There's always a risk of being tokenistic with this kind of work and research, but when carefully planned and carried out with the communities, the data gathered through these methods can be very rich and interesting. Participatory research methods make space for significant contributions from participants who are encouraged to voice their views and shape the outcomes. They can be involved in the production of knowledge, in the data analysis, in decision-making processes, in planning the activity. And in this sense, participatory methods can be used in museum context as well as tools to evaluate programs, for example. So visitors' feedback, rather than being gathered solely through interviews or surveys or questionnaires, can also be collected through creative participatory practices and in turn inform new practices in the organization. To recap, the principles of participatory research methods are horizontality and mutuality, the right to participate and have one's voice heard, an underlying relationship of trust between the researchers and the participants, It's a pluralistic approach and an open-ended one to knowledge production, and it implies sharing ownership and valuing everyone's expertise. As we will see, many, if not all of these principles also apply to participatory practice in museums. The relationship of trust, the sense of agency and ownership, the blurred lines of expertise, the sense of agency, the mutuality, but the pluralism. But before moving on to the second part of the presentation, where we'll be grounding these practices in museum theory, we could take a moment to reflect on the meaning of the words we use, a little bit as Giulio was saying. Participation has become a buzzword in the museum sector, and when talking about participation, it's essential to take a moment and discuss the theoretical aspects of what participation is, or what should be or could be, as well as the theories behind it. So if you would like to contribute in the chat, any word that comes to mind when we think about participating in cultural activities, whether we are doing this from the perspective of visitors or museum professionals, or both, as professionals sometimes are visitors in their free time. If words are important in our everyday relationships, so they should be in our relationship with the public, or in the relationship between the institution and the public. They contribute to build expectations, to shape the reality we live in, an institution we inhabit. For example, participation could mean attendance, as in taking part to museum events, or a more radical engagement with the museum through collaborative practices like co-curation, co-production, and so on, where audiences take an active role. So before moving on to sketching a history of how participatory practices have become such an important part of museum work and museum studies, I would like to draft a working definition of participatory practices for the scope of this presentation in museums. So participatory practices are people-centered approaches to museum work, where communities are placed at the heart of the organization and invited to shape the organization with museum staff. There are different levels of participation, as already anticipated a bit by Giulio, depending on different factors, and resources are surely one of these, but they all share the following principles. So it's about collaborating with audiences in meaningful and horizontal ways, doing with rather than for or to them. And with regards to this, some museums like to refer to their public as community members or community partners or constituencies, rather than visitors or users or audiences, implying a shift in the power dynamics through the language we use. Communities are involved in decision-making processes, so in all aspects of the museum work, and their voice is heard and taken into account. The museum and the community share authority and agency. Participation is not just another item on the agenda of the museum and another box to tick off. The relationship with audiences is intentional and sustained over time. Participatory work becomes part of the core work of the museum, of its strategic aims and goals. Participatory practices are open-ended processes, again, providing mutual benefit for the museum and for the community. As such, there's always an element of risk and failure, and we will come back to this later. Finally, they involve a high degree of trust between the museum and the community. They hold space for a plurality of voices and perspectives, and they allow collective learning and individual meaning-making. Now that we have outlined a working definition of participatory practices in museums, let's take a step back and ground these ideas in museum studies theory. In particular, I'm going to trace a very brief history of the key turning points in the history of museums to try and understand the trajectories along which these structures and practices developed. Of course, this is a very complex and broad debate. It's a 2-century-long development. I will try just to highlight the key steps that are important for our understanding of participatory practices. So the first public museums, the Western public museums, were founded in Europe between the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th. The British Museum was the first one to open in 1759. to host the collections recently acquired by Act of Parliament. Sir Sloan donated his collections at the condition that they could be accessible to the many. However, there were concerns about the behavior of working class people in the galleries, which is why for a few decades they implemented the system of credential checking. In 1793, the Louvre was opened to the citizens of Paris, becoming effectively the first public museum as we've come to know them. The project had been started already during the monarchy, but it was carried out to completion with the French Revolution. Throughout the 19th century, many other great public museums were founded, more or less for explicit educational purposes. For example, the South Kensington Museum in London. The aim was to improve the taste of the manufacturers so that in this case, British products would improve also their quality, therefore their value on the market. As museums welcomed the working class, another hope was that their social behavior would model on the middle class by proximity. And this has brought scholars like Tony Bennett to define 19th century museums as tools of social governance, a mechanism that would have taught to the masses to self-regulate. Arguably, these institutions had a very strong sense of hierarchy. Knowledge was bestowed upon the public from the curators through very strictly vertical structures and transmission of knowledge and information. And they were, to an extent, devices of political strategies. The purpose of this very brief account of the origins of the Western public museums is twofold. On the one hand, it is true that museum practice and museums have come a long way since the times where museums were only repositories of knowledge and elitist temples of untouchable objects. On the other hand, though, it is worth considering that the educational mission of museums, the dedication to the publics, have always been core concerns of the public museum and of museum work. And this probably speaks to how central learning and engagement are in museum work today. The modes of this work are still a work in progress, constantly changing and adapting, as the last year with COVID taught us. A key turning point in more recent museology and museum practice has happened around the 90s with new museology and Peter Virgo as a result of the social turmoil of the 60s and the 70s. Museums started to interrogate themselves about the politics of power at play within their structures and practices. Virgo theorized what he called new museology with the aim to problematize the authority of curators and museum staff in general and question the top-down approach to the transmission of knowledge. Over time, more attention has been given to audience needs and the members of the public have been increasingly recognized as active contributors of knowledge rather than passive consumers in a constructivist view of the museum experience. As a result, museums have striven to be spaces that welcome critical engagement, personal meaning making and lifelong learning, with the postmodern museum shift and knowledge ceasing to be seen as monolithic. New spaces opened up for visitors to construct their own personal meaning of the museum experience and bring in their own baggage of previous knowledge. In more recent years, museums have taken on a more active and, if we want, activist role towards issues of representation, social inclusion, accessibility. Some scholars argue they should strive to be representative and socially engaged, embracing the role as agents of change and defenders of human rights. In this sense, the work of scholars like Richard Sandell and Robert James has been particularly crucial. They argue that if museums are community organizations, then they have to be conscious of their responsibility to civil society and deliver activities that are responsive to actual community needs and not just aware of them, develop quality communication and build on empathy and mutuality. The participatory turn in museum studies and practice has been brought about by concerns on museum ethics and the social role of museums. It's within this tradition of museum studies that participatory practices in museums sit, not without any criticism or skepticism. When it comes to participation and museums, the work of Nina Simon is our go-to model. Her books, The Art of Relevance, The Participatory Museums, along with her work as founder of By and For All, her really left a mark in the sector. Of By and For All is a charity organization, is a non-profit organization that helps community organizations to build more sustainable and tailored community engagement programs worldwide. Lots of interesting resources are available on their website. Both these books are available in open access on her website, and I would encourage you to also explore her blog. Her writing is always very timely and very inspiring and very accessible as well. In The Art of Relevance, she talks about inviting audiences on their own terms, giving them the key to access and leaving them the freedom to do it in their own way. The Participatory Museum focuses more closely on practices. Experiments of co-production and co-curating are interesting platforms to test the boundaries of participation and negotiate power and authority with the public. She identifies different levels of participation, and this is modeled on the ladder of civic participation as well, that Giulio mentioned in his presentation. Depending on commitment, resources available, goals, and relationship with audiences, the level of participation can vary. Obviously, the relationship with the public starts with access, although access is not considered participation. The next one is consultation. The museum gathers feedback on specific issues. Contributory projects are those where participants leave comments during visits, share photos or memory of objects. Collaboration involves institutionally driven partnerships where visitors feel like co-owners of content and programs. And finally, co-creation entails shared authority. Participants' needs are taken into account from the start alongside those of the institution. She also argues that successful participatory experiences have to be designed for open-ended outcomes, trusting visitors' abilities as creators, remixers, and redistributors of content, but with clear scaffolding. The recipe seems to be able to design the right barrier, the one that will grant some level of comfort, but also provoke enough to make for a memorable experience. To balance and conclude this account of participatory practices, it's also important to consider the risks, the shortcomings, and the criticalities involved. In carrying out the critical appraisal of 12 engagement program in 12 UK museums across the UK, for the Paul Hamlin Foundation, Bernadette Lynch produced this report, Whose Cake Is It Anyway, in 2011, where she offers an insightful account of engagement work in museums, talking about the limitations and the mystifications of the participatory agenda. What resulted from her research is that despite the good intentions, sometimes participatory practices generate only the illusion of participation, resulting in frustration on both sides, so the museum staff and the participants. Also in this case, language and communication are key. Words matter, she says in the report. There's a clear need for both museum staff and audiences to understand the goals and intended outcome of participatory work beyond the rhetoric of shared authority or co-production, as a crucial thing to avoid disappointment to the communities involved. The successful examples in the report were the ones where open and transparent debate was enabled, even at a greater risk of conflict. So she concludes that true empowerment is achieved through conflict when it arises and not by neutralizing it. This brings us to the end of the second section. The evaluation of participatory practices, and most importantly of their occasional failures, is also important, as the planning phase. Too often participatory practices are considered inherently good, and museums and organizations tend to gloss over the failures, whereas sometimes we can learn from failing at something as much as from succeeding at it. Evaluation can help the museum to measure the impact of past projects and advocate for future initiatives, also in terms of funding. Participatory outcomes may be external, like increased incidence of conversation among visitors, or internal, such as development of new skills and enhanced relationships. Participatory projects are not just for participants, so it's important to define goals also for staff members and non-participating audiences. They often benefit from incremental measurement techniques, so it's important to measure impact as you go and reassess when needed. Also important to value quality over quantity. The goal in participatory museums is often to create trust in a genuine, long-term developing relationship with their audiences. As a side note, really interesting resources, toolkits, and frameworks can be found at sector-relevant organizations' websites. So, for example, the Museum Association in the UK has a self-assessment framework for participatory practice, this power to the people, which is up in the slide. The American Alliance of Museums has lots of really interesting articles, ICOM as well. And I would also encourage you to check the websites of those foundations that invest in participatory, in socially engaged practice, like the Paul Hamlin Foundation with the report Our Museum, which is a very interesting tool. Now we will turn to the third part and final part of this presentation with a series of case studies. I'm aware of time, so I'll just try to be as quick as I can. Starting from arts-based participatory workshops to co-curation. This is not intended to be an exhaustive overview of participatory practices, rather just a way of grounding through practice what we have discussed so far theoretically. The first case study is a hands-on workshop. The Museum of Solidarity Salvador Allende in Santiago, in Chile, hosts a series of workshops where participants learn how to develop irrigation systems, build seedlings, prepare the soils to cultivate terraces. The workshops are completely designed and led by local residents of the República neighborhood. The aim was to safeguard the biodiversity of the environment, recover popular knowledge, and reflect consciously on the coexistence between nature and the city, and to connect the museum with its immediate surroundings in ways that were meaningful for local communities. This second project, it's an artist-run participatory workshop, the Chimera Planetarium. It was carried out through the collaboration between the artist Chiara Dell'Erba, primary and artist-run gallery in Nottingham, and the Year 5 student from a local school. Through a series of collaborative workshops, the artist invited the students to map their surrounding, paying attention to the plants in particular. The results of this collaborative process became the material for a public artwork installed outside of the school. The collaboration has developed over a span of several months and resulted in the commission of a second collaborative project with the local school. So this is an example of how participatory practices can foster the creation of long-term relationships and new networks. Community Conversation is the name of a series of online open conversations among community members around the theme of collective care, hosted by the Museum of Art and History in Santa Cruz in California. These are discursive events originated during the pandemic. Many museums have adapted their program to online delivery during the months of lockdown and then decided to maintain this blended programming. When asked how they had come to the idea of hosting these, the museum explained that they had asked themselves what the community would need, and they had sought ways to be participatory, but still be intentional and be present. The whole program addresses ideas and practices of ancestral healing, breathing, acts of services, collective care. Meetings occur online on a regular basis, providing a safe space for dialogue and exchange. This other example is a community-led tour by students of a local primary school. In the months preceding the event, the engagement curator at primary in Nottingham worked with the students in situ to study together the story of the neighborhood, gather stories from family members and meaningful memories, and prepare the final tour that concluded the project. Community-led activities foster a sense of agency and ownership, extending beyond the physical space of the museum. Participants are experts of their own areas and communities. This is a chance of letting them take the lead. The story of Liverpool City region through its trees is a community sourcing project where OpenEye, an art gallery situated in the center of Liverpool, invited the public to create a history of Liverpool through its trees, using personal stories and photography. For the initial project, the photographer Andy Yates took pictures of 8 trees in the city of Liverpool based on the suggestions of tree professionals, historians, and family members. The project then grew to become a crowdsourced collection of tree pictures and stories from the people of Liverpool. The gallery of the project is now available on their website. Another very fascinating example of community sourcing is the sound map of soundscapes during COVID. The map is available online and users can add content and contribute their own recordings. The digital, in this sense, is a great facilitator of rapid exchange of content with relatively low costs and potentially endless creative opportunities. This is a really good way for museums to reach new audiences or existing ones and continue sustaining their social presence beyond their physical one. Something similar has been done by the Museum of London, the Museum of Home in London. During lockdown, they collected reflections about the change in perception of domestic space, and this project is also available on their website. This picture, and we are coming to the final 2 examples, is The Past is Now. This is a co-curated exhibition on the legacy of the British Empire, organized by the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in 2018. The exhibition was co-curated by staff and a group of members of the public who were asked to select artworks from the collection of the museum and produce an exhibition, alongside a team of museum experts. In the final display, the community-curated labels were printed in yellow, in contrast to those written by curators and museum staff. So this is a good example to reflect on shared authority and expertise. Was it really a good idea to clearly distinguish the community-curated labels? Could they have done it differently? Also, the exhibition had lots of opportunities for the public to leave comments and reflect and leave their feedback on what they thought the legacy of the empire meant to them. The final example is again from the Museo Salvador Allende in Santiago. Within its outreach program, the museum has established a long-term collaboration and relationship with a local group of textileras, crafters who meet regularly at the museum to practice, learn, and teach each other traditional crafts. The act of embroidering and sewing together represented for the textileras a resource of resistance in the face of major social struggles that Chile was facing at the time. In this way, the museum becomes, by all means, an active social agent at the neighborhood level, opening up its spaces to the needs of the local population. As a result of this collaboration, the museum hosted an exhibition displaying the works crafted and created during the workshops and acquired one of them in the collection. So this was the last case study. Hopefully this gives you an idea of the broad range of activities that museums can organize to engage their publics, sometimes inviting them in the space of the museum or inviting them to use the space on their own terms, see for example the textileras. Other times, participatory practices can be great to reach new audiences, especially when carried out digitally, or to engage with existing ones. At times they are used to encourage visitors to explore their surroundings, take ownership of their own expertise of the area, like through guided tours or oral histories. Other times participation can be scaffolded and inform experiments of co-curation. A very brief consideration of the impact and long-term implications of COVID-19 on museum practices, especially in terms of participation strategies, ought to be done. The pandemic has deeply shaken our sense of social space, what we need out of institutions, and what we value about them. The digital has opened numerous opportunities for engagement and outreach, although also heightened the inequalities of access in terms of the digital divide. On another hand, museums have been able to reach global audiences, but they often become more attentive to their local communities at the same time, stretching between the international and the hyperlocal. In a way, this could be framed as cosmopolitan localism. And finally, the precariousness of museum workers worldwide has been exposed, and considerations of well-being of both staff and communities are crucial in the participatory model of the museum. So this brings us to the end of this presentation. I would like to end just on a slide that acts as a checklist for participatory practices and a recap for us. So who is the targeted community? Is it existing audiences or non-goers? Is it a particular group within your audiences, etc.? What values are informing these practices? Do they align with the mission and the values of the organization? What are the resources available in terms of budget, capability of staff, emotional capability of staff, material resources? What are the expectations? Again, it's really important that the expectations are clear for everyone involved and from the beginning. As we said, language is something to really think about carefully. What are the mutual benefits? If the museum invites people to participate, what are they getting out of it? And what is the museum looking for to get out of it? Is your goal measurable? It's important to evaluate participatory projects to understand what works and what doesn't. But in order to do this, we need to have clear goals and clear indicators for them. Is it increased attendance, or is it the museum wants to engage a small group of visitors but build quality relationship with them? And finally, is it sustainable? As we repeated in the first part of the presentation, the core of participatory practices is trust. And as in every relationship, meaningful engagement requires a certain level of commitment and care. So I hope this was helpful. I'm happy to take questions, or if you have any, or to hear examples of participation.